Nearly every country that adopted the AK has tried to replace it at least once. Some tried 3 or 4 times. Because replacing the AK turned out to be harder, more expensive, and more politically dangerous than anyone expected. And what followed wasn't a clean path of technological progress, when radical designs that tried to reinvent from what works, and most of them just collapsed under cost and logistics. And only conservative upgrades survived by just keeping it extremely simple and cheap to produce. And over again, militaries didn't care if it's technically the best rifle. They just want it to work. And this cycle started in 1959, when the Soviets themselves tried to make the AK cheaper to make. Starting with the Type 1 AKs that used stamped receivers. During this time in the early Soviet post-war factories, they lacked the precision and welding consistency to manufacture it reliably. So what this looked like was that, for example, these internal guide rails had to be welded into the thin receiver shell. And combined with poor heat treatment and warping, rejection rates were extremely high. As a result, the Soviets temporarily abandoned stamping and switched to heavier but more manufacturable milled receivers for the Type 2 and Type 3. But it was time-consuming and expensive. So by the late 1950s, engineers finally figured out a better stamped receiver production process. The result was the AKM that dropped the weight from 3.5 kilograms to about 3 kilograms. And they also added a slanted muzzle brake, new laminated wood furniture, and most importantly, manufacturing costs plummeted. So, by this time, over 10 million got produced in the USSR alone, and the global production hit 70 to 100 million when you count licensed and unlicensed copies. And this established the build template worldwide, except Finland and Israel, who stubbornly kept milled receivers for precision reasons. So in the mid to late 1950s, Finland discreetly obtained a small number of Polish-made AK-type rifles for evaluation. And they made it better than the original that could handle minus 40 degrees, with snow and ice, without jamming in the Arctic region. And by 1958, Finland was also pursuing Soviet AKs as a temporary stopgap while a domestic rifle program moved forward. That evaluation process ultimately led to the adoption of the 7.62x39 RK62 in 1962. So this version of an AK that shoots 2 MOA accuracy, basically sniper grade for a service rifle, and it's a full kilogram heavier than a standard AK. But Finnish soldiers carried that extra weight for 60+ years because it simply never failed. And in this era, it has marked the beginning of a revolution in small caliber arms. While the United States was adopting the M16 and replacing the M14, the Soviets saw America's M16 and said, "We can do that better." So by the 1960s, they realized smaller bullets meant soldiers could carry way more ammo, control automatic fire easier, and still drop enemies at combat ranges. But the powerful 7.62 rounds couldn't match the 5.56's range and accuracy. So in 1967, they started a rifle competition. A designer named Konstantinov built this crazy balanced action system with insane recoil control, but it was too expensive and complicated. And then Kalashnikov showed up. And he delivered a rifle that is basically an AK, but it shoots the brand new 5.45 caliber bullet. It was simple, cheap, and compatible with existing factories' logistics. And that was the birth of the AK-74. The rifle was adopted on January 19, 1974, and first saw combat during the Soviet-Afghan War in 1979. Its new 5.45x39mm cartridge fired a roughly 52-grain bullet at close to 3,000 feet per second, and when compared to the AKM, these test trials showed significantly improved hit probability, especially in automatic fire, aided by the rifle's distinctive muzzle brake. Millions were produced at Izhevsk and Tula, with licensed production across the Warsaw Pact. Some variants, like Romania's PAMD-86, remain in service or reserve use decades later. And while that part of the world was adapting to a new AK, Israel made the Western version of the AK, with a bit of a Western twist. So after the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel had a problem. Their FNFALs were heavy, unreliable trash in desert conditions, but enemy AK-47 was flawless. And And so designer Yusriel Galili went back to the drawing board, basing off the Finnish Valmet RK62 receivers, and turned it into the rifle called the Galil ARM, that weighs about 4.5 kilograms, and it was 2 pounds heavier than an M16. It kept the milled forging process because 5.56 runs higher pressure than 7.62, and he moved the sights back to longer sight radius. And he also added a bottle opener to the handguard, because back then, everything came in glass bottles with metal caps. No plastic, no screw tops. Soldiers were destroying magazine lips trying to crack open drinks. Now let's move on to China's experience with the AK and see what they ended up replacing. It all started when the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War exposed a serious problem for the PLA using Type 56 SKS rifles without full auto-suppression capability. So in close terrain, that imbalance means losing battles. In the mid-1980s, China came up with the Type 81, using a selective fire short-stroke gas piston design. But China didn't just stop there. Instead of refining the traditional AK-style design further, they made a radical leap with the QBZ-95 bullpup rifle, firing an entirely new 5.8 by 42mm cartridge, and Chinese engineers wanted to offer the military with something that performs better than the NATO 5.56 and the 5.45 Soviet. So that means higher muzzle velocity and longer theoretical engagement distances. The bullpup configuration shortened the overall length for CQB. In practice, however, there were some problems with the first generation, such as reload ergonomics, jamming, and all the typical starting problems associated when developing a new rifle. Over time, the confidence in the bullpup concept has declined. Later, the QBZ-191 design returned to a conventional rifle layout, and now the magazine is in the front. And also, the rifle now has full-length Picatinny rails to mount accessories, top rail to mount optics, an adjustable stock, ambidextrous controls, and a split receiver design conceptually similar to modern Western rifles. So now let's fast forward to the early 1980s as a pivotal moment in history with a lot going on during this time. The Soviets weren't satisfied after seeing what other countries have done, and so they started the most ambitious Soviet AK replacement program that led to the formal Abacon competition in 1981. And the requirement was brutally simple. Just double the accuracy over the AK-74, and that's it. So a designer named Gennady Nikonov created something revolutionary with his ASM prototype. They gave the name the AN-94. The weapon used what the Russians called recoil-shifted pulse. It's a mechanism where the entire barrel and receiver assembly recoils backward inside the rifle's housing during firing. And this allowed the AN-94 to fire 2-round bursts at 1,800 rounds per minute before the shooter felt any recoil. When troops tested it at 100 meters, firing from standing positions, the hit probability with short bursts jumped from 0.30 for the AK-74 to 0.63 for the AN-94. And that's more than doubling accuracy exactly as required. But nothing is perfect, because the internal pulley mechanism with cables and moving parts made it far more intricate than any traditional Kalashnikov. And the cost of this design is estimated roughly 4 to 6 times more than the AK-74M. And when Gennady Nikonov died at age 55, any further evolution of the design, unfortunately, came to a stop, and the AN-94 fell victim to a pattern repeated throughout small arms history, where radical innovation consistently loses to evolutionary improvement. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia faced economic turmoil in the 90s, paying 3 to 6 times more for a complex rifle that required extensive training just wasn't sustainable. So the failure of the AN-94 forced the Russians to refocus on the AK-74. So by the late 80s, INSAS began developing the 74M with a clear goal, which was to unify 4 existing 74 variants into one universal rifle. So, the development was completed in '91, but the collapse of the Soviet Union delayed the full adoption until the Russian Federation formally adopted it in '95. The new AK-74M has side-folding stock, all-polymer furniture, simplified optics rail, and a lightened bolt carrier to cut recoil. Also, the manufacturing cost was much cheaper, and they used dimple-pressed barrel hardware instead of pins, stamped gas tube lever instead of milled, and they used basic rivets to replace complicated assemblies processes. Overall, it was much cheaper and simpler. Then came the genius move with the AK-100 Export series. It's multi-caliber variants for international customers, where countries like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia got licensed to make these AK-103 rifles. At the same time, India also cut a deal and flooded the market. And then Iran, Libya, Pakistan all bought in. Basically, Russia turned a domestic consolidation into a global money printer during this time. Okay, so by now you've seen how the AK-74M came to be. And now, let's shift focus to Eastern Europe, where Poland was producing AK variants called the PMK. Basically, they are AK-47 copies, also the KBK, AKM, and WZ-88 Tantal. When Poland joined NATO, they adopted the KBS WZ-96 barrel in 5.56. It's basically a modernized AK for NATO ammo. But in 2007, they started the MSBS Grot program, Poland's first non-AK design. It fires 700 to 900 rounds per minute, uses a short-stroke piston, converts between conventional and bullpup, and takes Stanag magazines. At $2,700 per unit, Poland ordered 53,000 rifles in 2017, expanding to 70,000 by 2023. And that's roughly $189 million total. And the Grot was 300,000 plus units for all troops and reservists. And now, let's move our focus on another Eastern European country. The next-door neighbor Czechoslovakia at the time was the only Warsaw Pact nation that built its VZ-58 rifle, which only looked like an AK, but used completely different mechanics. After joining NATO in 1999, they adopted the CZ-805 Bren in 2010, roughly $63 million for 7,000 rifles and 1,300 carbines. And the improved CZ Bren 2 came in 2016, weighing about half a kilo lighter with better ergonomics. Meanwhile, Hungary kept their Soviet AK-63s for nearly 2 decades after joining NATO in 1999. Finally, in 2018, they licensed the Czech CZ Bren 2. That's roughly a $123 million tech transfer deal, planning 200,000 firearms by 2028, and AK-63s were still in use today. So while Eastern European nations abandoned the AK for NATO standardization, India moved in the opposite direction. And pretty much no one knows what India was using, so here it is. They were using the indigenous rifle called the INSAS, and it was an AKM-based design with FNFAL and Galil influences developed in the 1980s. In the Kargil War of 1999, the conflict exposed its fatal flaws in low-temperature environment. During the 3-month high-altitude conflict with Pakistan in the Himalayas, where temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius, the INSAS had polymer magazines cracked in the cold, constant jamming during firefights, and the burst mode also had issues. So Indian soldiers tried to acquire as many AK-47s from fallen enemies whenever possible. And by 2014, India's Central Reserve Police Force officially requested dropping INSAS entirely. That means later, India has acquired the license to produce Russian AK-203s to replace their aging rifles. Started in 2021 with a contract of roughly 601,000 rifles at 5,124 crore rupees. That equates to $680 million, about $1,100 apiece. During the same year, Vietnam presents a unique case where they are neither abandoning nor embracing the AK. Vietnam actually wanted modernization while maintaining logistical continuity, so they looked into adopting the IWI Galil ACE 31 and 32 through a $100 million Israeli investment. And the critical decision was to save logistics costs, meaning they wanted to retain the .762 caliber because they had massive stockpiles of AK magazines that they still want to use. So long story short, the Z111 factory immediately began modifications, fusing Galil ACE parts with familiar AK components to ease the transition for troops trained on Kalashnikovs. So in 2019, the STV-380 standard rifle and STV-215 carbine were born, and they are built on Galil ACE milled receivers, but incorporating AK-style fire selectors and charging handles and ergonomics. Finally, both rifles entered frontline service in 2021, while Russia is seeing other countries modifying the AKs, but that's not what they want. The Russian military wanted better ergonomics, improved accuracy, and modern accessory compatibility through the Ratnik Future Soldier program, leading to what we know as the AK-12. But it failed big time in the lab and on the battlefield by trying to reinvent the wheel. The first was Vladimir Zlobin's 2012 design. It was a radical departure that added ambidextrous controls, a switchable charging handle, and a 3-round burst mode, essentially merging M16 features with an AK platform. But it proved fragile and prohibitively expensive, with parts failing in trials and costs climbing to 5 or 6 times that of the AK-74M. The second attempt came in 2014, when Sergei Urjumtsev took the opposite approach, with conservative evolution instead of radical redesign. His AK-400 prototype retained approximately 60% parts commonality with the AK-74M, which dramatically cut costs while still meeting military requirements. This pragmatic strategy worked, and both the 5.45 caliber AK-12s and 7.62 AK-15s were officially adopted in January 2018. The production version brought meaningful upgrades, including a full-length Picatinny top rail, improved barrel accuracy, adjustable folding stock, 2-round burst mode, and polymer magazines with viewing windows. More importantly, unit costs dropped to roughly $600 to $700, a fraction of what Zlobin's radical design would have cost. However, combat experience in Ukraine exposed serious problems with the design. The 2-round burst mechanism proved unreliable under field conditions, and the handguards suffered from poor heat resistance during sustained fire. So, these issues forced yet another redesign in 2023. The updated model removed the problematic burst mechanism entirely, replacing it with a simpler, ambidextrous fire selector. Engineers added an adjustable cheek riser for optics use, redesigned the handguards with better heat resistance, and controversially switched to a fixed muzzle device that eliminated quick detach capability for suppressors. Despite these setbacks, the rifle remains Russia's standard infantry weapon with mass production ongoing. While Russia struggled with expensive redesigns and combat failures, a smaller nation found a smarter solution to the same problem. So, Serbia faced a challenge unique to their geopolitical position. They weren't in NATO, and they weren't aligned with Russia either. And they had massive stockpiles of 7.62 ammunition they couldn't afford to abandon. So what did they do? Zastava's solution was elegant instead of complicated. They needed a modern cartridge with identical case dimensions to 7.62, so one rifle platform could handle both. And their answer was the modular M19, chambered in both 7.62x39 and 6.5 Grendel. It kept the same rotating bolt locking system and used the same AK mags. Soldiers just swapped barrels, and Zastava made that dead simple. A cross latch on the receiver lets you change barrels without disassembling the rifle or using tool. The M19 was adopted in 2022, proving Kalashnikov's 1947 design principles remain the benchmark against which all successors are measured. Programs that honor these principles succeed without reinventing the wheel. However, these programs that prioritize theoretical performance over practical implementation mostly fail due to cost increases and overcomplication. So while the AK was going through its transformation, the M16 did too, and you can watch that and learn more about it right here.